Okay, B'Shana Tova Mutzlachat, we are starting the mishnat sofrim, which basically the Mishnah Berurah wrote the mishnat sofrim, which is all the laws of each one of the letters, the exact shape of the letters, each one of the letters, how it should be. Just a little bit of background to this whole issue. The issue of the shapes of the letter doesn't appear explicitly, in Chazal, in the Shulchan Aruch, Rambam, or anything like that. There are some details in the Chazal regarding the shapes of the letters, that we try to derive from. But again, it doesn't appear explicitly in the Shulchan Aruch. There are two books from the Rishonim that do discuss the shapes of the letters. One of them is called in a book called Tikkun Tfilin by one of the Rishonim. Let me just tell you the name. Famous one after the Tikkun Tfilin. That was Tikkun Tfilin was Rabbeinu Avram Mizunshine, who was a student of the Marami Württemberg, and then afterwards Rabbi Shimon ben Rabbi Elazar wrote a book, which is the well-known one, Orach Chaim. Okay, I put it on the Google Drive, so anybody's interested, at least an old edition that I was able to copy, take down from Hebrew books, that they wrote about the shapes of the letters. And most of what the Beit Yosef and siman, when he discusses the shapes of the letter, writes about, are taken from that book, Orach Chaim. That's based on that, the Mishnah Berurah wrote his mishnat sofrim. However, it should be noted that, as we know, that's not the only custom. We have, even though that is what nowadays serves as the basis for what we call Ktav Beit Yosef. Again, the Beit Yosef copied these guidelines from the Orach Chaim, and that's the shapes of the letters as customary by the Ashkenazim. There are other traditions regarding the shape of the letters. For example, we also have the Ktav Sfaradim, which again is not even that's not unanimous. In other words, there's the common Ktav, which is common by Sfaradim. However, if you look at old Sifrei Torah, you'll see various different shapes of letters on various issues. There's also what we call Ktav HaArizal, which is very similar to the Ktav of the Beit Yosef, what's customary by the Ashkenazim, with slight differences. Okay, so there are actually some very nice editions, modern editions of the Mishnat Sofrim, with good pictures and explanations. I saw various editions. I put two on the Google Drive, but they're not the only one. They're not the only ones. One is from a sofer stam by the name of Eliezer Adam, who compiled the Mishnat Sofrim with pictures. And the other one, which I put on the Google Drive, which I'll use primarily, is from a new edition of the Mishnah Berurah called Madurat Aliba Deil. And what I like about their edition is that besides giving the pictures, for the Ktav Ashkenazif, which the Mishnah Berurah writes, they also give the pictures of how it's customary by the Sfaradim. So it's nice to see the differences between the two, and also they provide there a lot of details beyond what appears in the Mishnah Berurah about what happened with the Avad and this mistake and this mistake. They collect from a lot of books, so it's a really nice compilation. Again, it's not the only one. If you look at the Mishnah Berurah, also the Adar edition, they have some very good pictures. I have another Mishnah Berurah here called Pe'er Halacha with a lot of pictures. But out of all of them, I like the one that I put on the Google Drive, which we'll use again because it's sort of more encompassing and also covers other traditions as well. Okay. So without any further ado, again, it's a big question. Nowadays it's sort of become more set, what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to write Ktav Stam. But in the past, you see that different sofrim had different traditions. Old Sifrei Torah, there were actually quite a bit more variation regarding the shapes of the letters. So it's important also to understand not everything regarding the shapes of the letters is makiv b'diavad. Some of it we do l'chatchila. There are some details, mostly those things which we do have more Mekorot and Chazal for, that we would say they might pass even b'diavad. But this is really, an important field, if you want to check, be able to check a Sefer Torah mistake or Tfilin or Mezuzot. This is really where most of the work is based on, besides the the halachot that we already studied. Let's get started. start. First of all, here in the mishnat sofrim, before he gets into the letters themselves, he gives some general rules for writing. One has to do with kisidran, and the other has to do with chak tochot. Okay, so let's just go through it quickly, and then we'll get started on the letters themselves. Okay, so as we know, the halakha, why? Because these are really important halachot for how the sofer should write, and as opposed to the letters that you can see if the sofer made a mistake or not, whether he wrote kisidran or whether he did chak tochot is not something that you'll be able to see. Okay, this is a little scary. After I read, everything that we've been studying, plus reading these halachot of kisidran and chak tochot, you really have to put a lot of faith in the sofer because he could very easily not follow one of these halachot, and some of them are ma'akev even b'diavad, and no one would have any idea about it. So you really have to trust the sofer that he did follow the halachot, because it's very tempting and very easy, not to follow them. Okay, so first of all, kisidran. Kisidran is only halacha in tefillin and mezuzot, and not in sefer Torah. Sefer Torah you can write out of order. In tefillin and mezuzot you have to write the order. Okay, now why is this problematic? Or it's easy to write kisidran. The problem is, let's say you made a mistake or you didn't write the letter properly, and then you can't go back and fix because it would be a problem of kisidran. Okay, now oftentimes sofrim, the way they like to do it is they like to write a few letters, to write continuously, and then go back up, and then they patch up all the letters that are not so good. So the question is, when can you do that and when can't you? Okay, so the general rule of thumb here that the Mishnah Berurah says is that if you wrote a full letter, if you wrote only a partial letter, and then afterwards you wrote a full letter, you can't go back, okay, and fix it. In other words, however, if you wrote only, you went forward and you didn't write it in full, the next letter you didn't write it in full, then you can go back and fix. Why? It only becomes kelo kesidran if you've written the next letter full, and then you can't go back to the previous letter. Okay? However, he says also that...
I'm sorry, can I ask one question, Rav Nirmat?
Yes,
if this is so, then theoretically speaking, you can never fix a Sefer Torah.
No, Sefer Torah doesn't have halacha b'kesidran. So Sefer Torah is not a problem. You can always fix it. We're only talking about tefillin and mezuzot.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry. So kisidran, the problem is as follows: as long as the sofer hasn't yet written the next letter in full, so he can go back and fix. There's no limitations on that. Once he's written the next letter in full, then if he would now go back and make a correction previously, then it would be a problem of kisidran. Okay. Now, so that's one thing. Next point that he says here, that what does kisidran mean? Kisidran doesn't mean that the letters have to be perfect, but they do have to be written. Okay? So he says as follows, that any tikkun that even without it, even though it's not kasher, but any tikkun that even without it, the content is readable. In other words, you would still read the letter as it is. For example, like you wrote a yud, but without the kotz asmari, or anything like that, then there's not a problem of, you can go back and make those fixes. Why? Because when we say kisidran, we're referring mainly to the content of it. Okay, he uses here a nice expression to explain it. He says, okay, משום דעיקר הדברים כסדר נכתבו, לשם אות עליה אפילו בלא התיקון. In other words, if I have the letter, even though it's not a kasher letter, but it's still the shape of the letter, so since עיקר הדברים כסדר נכתבו in terms of the content, then that's fine. It's not a problem of בלא כסדרה. Okay, so let's see now some details on this. So he says as follows. First of all, he gives a warning. He says, Okay, he says, כן מהנכון לסופר שיזהר בתפילין ומזוזות, שלא להניף ידו על שום אות לתקנו באיזה תיקון אחר שכתב האות שאחריו, אם לא בדבר שנמצא כתוב בפירוש בספרי הפוסקים שזה מותר לתקן אפילו אחר כך, ולא ידמה בעצמו מילתא למילתא. In other words, you have to be very careful on this on all the פרטי דינים. So, he says, אין בחיי אדם שכתב דויה מתנאי ספר שלו שלא נעיף עליהם ברזל מחמת זה. Okay? He says, כבר ראיתי אנשי יראה אלוקים מפזרים במון רב על תיקון תפילין, ולוקחים מסופר אומן שיכול לעשות בתים נעים ומודרים כדין בכל פרטיהם ואשרי חלקם, אבל יותר מזה צריך להיזהר על עניין התפילין בפנים והם הפרשיות, שיעשה הסופר כל אותיותיהם כדין בכל אותם ויודעיהם, לקח צריך שיהיה הסופר בקיא בדיני כתיבת האותיות. Okay? So he really needs to do it properly. Okay? So he says now as follows. אם חסר בכתב התגין, certainly the תגין או הקבוצה של יוד, מבואר במגן אברהם יש לתקן אפילו אחר שנכתבו. So that's a correction you can go back and make. Why? בכל שהאות צורתו עליה, אף על גב דבגולו קבוצו של יוד השמאלי פסול לרבין אותם, וגם תגים יש אומרים דפסול אם לא תיקן, מכל מקום והיו הדברים גוף הדברים כסדר נכתבו. Okay, so anything where you have the shape of the letter, even though it's missing a bit, even though if that part is makib, like קבוצו של יוד, because we do have a source in Chazal that you see the two opinions on what exactly קבוצו של יוד means. But whatever it means, there has to be something there. So nevertheless, since it's clearly a yud, then it's not a problem of Shaloki Sidran to go back and fix it. Also tagin, right? Because tagin is not the letter themselves, it's just an addition on the letter. Okay, וכן להפריד הנגיעות בין אות לאות שרי אחר כך. Okay, ופשוט דווקא אם לא נשתנה צורתו על ידי נגיעה. In other words, if letters are touching, right? So it is makiv because it's not mukaf vil. But on the other hand, if it hasn't affected the shape of the letters, it's just touching, so that you can go back and separate the letters. That's fine to do. Okay? וכן י' האלף והשין והעין ורגל התף שאין נוגעים, ותינוק ולא חכים ולא טיפש קורא אותו כצורתן, או ב' וד' וכדומה שאין הגג מחובר לארץ למעלה, ותינוק וקורא אותו כנפוצן, רשאי לתקן אחר כך. Okay, also he says, if let's say we have all these letters and we'll see that they're made up of different parts, but all the parts need to touch. The only letters that we have parts that don't touch are Hey and Kuf, but all the other letters, all the parts need to touch. So even if they're not touching, but the space there is so small that a Tinok reads it as the letter itself, then it is considered that the letter is written, and that is a tikkun that you can go back and make, and it's not a problem of Shaloki Sidran. Okay, he brings here a machloket. What about Nikar Pridatan Lehedya? But it seems like Nikar Adini holds that you can be lenient and fix it. Okay. Another one. It says here, כתב עוד הפרי מגדים, כלל הדמיתא, כל שאין כותב רק מוחק או מושך, לא הווי שלא כסדרן. המשל לאבותיך מלא וו, צריך למחוק הוו, ואף על ידי זה היה תיבה כשתי תיבות, ימשוך הבית. אף על פי שכותב, משיכה עליו כלום עבד את תחילנה מצורת בדדה. Okay, so let's say you wrote לאבותיך with a vav and you need to erase it. So how do you fix it? You need to do two things. First of all, you need to erase the vav. Secondly, you need to extend the bet to fill up the space because it's one word, לאבותיך. So he says that's also not a problem of Shelo Kesidran. Why? Because just erasing the vav is not a problem because I'm not writing anything, I'm just erasing. And also extending the bet is not a problem because the bet was already written. Okay? However, אבל ודאי אם עשה בית מתחילה כצורת נון כתופה, אחר כך משכו לבית אבא שלו כסדרה. But if the bet, I originally wrote it as a nun, and then I'm changing it to a bet, then it's a problem שלו כסדרה. Again, if I wrote already even the next letter. Okay? He says, וכן אפילו אם נכתב האות מתחילה כסדר, ואחר כך נתקן מחמת איזה דבר שהוא, כיוון שנתבטל צורת האות, כשחוזר אחר כך הוא מתקן על שלו כסדרה. Even if I wrote it correctly originally, but later, let's say some ink spilled, and then I have to rewrite it, that's also considered a problem of Shelo Kesidran. Okay, he says though, however, you have to be careful on this, because if it is a different letter, then again it becomes a problem Shelo Kesidran. Like for example, if you wrote a resh instead of a dalet. So even though you just need to add just a very little bit in the corner, in the upper corner, just to make it into a dalet, still that's a problem Shelo Kesidran, because it's a different letter. Okay, so that's the general rules of Kesidran and Shelo Kesidran, again, only applying in Tfilin and Mezuzot. Now, another set of halachot that he gets into, again, he summarizes. We saw this all previously in the halachot as well, but is chak tochot. Chak tochot, again, is that you cannot create a letter by erasing. You have to have the positive action of writing the letter. So if, let's say, right now it doesn't have a shape of a letter, but I can erase a bit off to make it into the proper letter, then it's a problem of chak tochot. Okay, now he says here, chak tochot is a bit of the reverse of shelo kisidran. Because if I'm just erasing, then like we said, it's not a problem shelo kisidran. But if by the erasing I'm creating a letter, then I do get into a problem of chak tochot. Okay, so let's say, for example, I have a samich, and then ink fell in the middle of the samich, so it's all filled up. So I need to erase the middle of that ink, so that would be a problem, chak tochot, because I'm using erasing to create the letter. Okay, and even if I'll add in a little bit to the samich itself, it won't help. So the way to make it chak, anytime you need to make a correction by erasing, I cannot just erase. I sort of have to erase more until it doesn't even have a shape of the letter, and then I can go back and complete it. Now, on all these erasings, we saw all kinds of machlokot. Some opinions say that it's enough just to have the end of the letter written properly, even though the beginning of it was written by chak tochot. Some say the entire letter needs to be written by chak tochot. So we'll see as we get into the various letters what happens if they were not written correctly. Each time it won't be enough just to erase. Anytime I have a problem that there's too much ink, it's never good enough just to erase, because then that's a problem of chak tochot. The only way it could be permitted is if I'm erasing more, like at least that entire section of the letter, and then rewriting it. Okay? We'll soon see some examples as we start the letters. Okay. Any questions or comments so far? Okay. So let's get into the letters. First letter we have is Tzurat Ot Aleph. Okay, now let me show you the pictures that they have here. You see, very nice. They have here the Ashkenazi, and then the Sfaradi version, and then this is another custom, okay, which I'll get into. Okay, so the first thing he says here in the mishnat sofrim regarding the aleph, so you can see in the Ktav Ashkenazi, the aleph is built with this diagonal line, which is what we call the gag of the aleph, and then we have two yudim. We have a yud here, and then an upside down yud on the bottom part. That's what the aleph is shaped of. Okay, that's what he says here. He says, "Tהיה נקודה עליונה כאין יוד, ועוקץ קטן עליה, יהיה פניה עם העוקץ הפוך קצת כלפי מעלה." Okay, so he says this part of the aleph should be like a yud, and it should have an oketz katan aleh. Okay, this is the kutzos shel yud. So he's saying even in the aleph, even though it's not a yud, but since the aleph is comprised of a yud, it should have this oketz of the yud. Okay. Next thing that he says is v'yerech hayud davuk el gag haguf be'emtza gag. Right, the yud should be connected in the middle of the gag of the aleph, as you see here. This is one of the differences with Sfaradim, that Sfaradim don't have it in the middle, they have it a little bit lower than the middle, in the bottom half. Okay, but Ktav Ashkenazi should be in the middle. Okay, this is not Me'akev though. Even in Ktav Ashkenazi, if you have it less, it's fine, but Lechatchila it should be here. Okay. They say here also that if it's not really a yud, it's also b'diavad kashem. Lechatchila, this is the shape. And Sfaradi, it's also like a yud. Okay, just it's placed a little bit different. Okay, ויש סוף הגג של צד ימין לכתחילה עקום למעלה מאחוריו קצת. This is referring סוף הגג. Again, this is the gag. So סוף הגג של ימין, it should be עקום למעלה מאחוריו קצת. So this is the upper thing. You see that it sort of points up and down a little bit. Okay. In Faradim, it's not really like that. Some do have like an okitz on the bottom side here. It's Faradim. Okay, but they don't really have this okitz klepei mala like an Ashkenazim on the bottom half of the room. Okay. Next point is והנקודה שלמטה תהיה רחוקה מן ראש של הגוף כשיעור עובי קולמוס וחצי. Okay? In other words, here he's referring to the bottom yud. So the bottom part, if you're measuring the distance, it should be about a kulmus and a half length. Again, what does it mean, kulmus? Kulmus is sort of the width of the kulmus when you're creating sort of the wide line. So he says, right? The reason for this is, again, the main point is just that this yud should not touch the gad. So that's why this is the distance that they say b'chatchila to make. Okay. ולנקודה התחתונה יהיה לכתחילה עוקץ קטן למטה לצד ימין. Again, the bottom yud also should have because again, it's an upside down yud, so it should have this also kutzah shel yud, just like the upper yud. Okay. In K'tav Sfaradi, it goes in this direction, the kutzah shel yud, not on the right hand side like in the K'tav Ashkenazi, but it goes here on the left hand side. Okay. Let me just go back to the Mishnah to see where we're at. He says, Ovi kulmus nikra rochav hakav hayotze min hakulmus kshu kotev. It's when we say kulmus hachetzi, we're talking about the width of the kulmus of the line that comes out when you're making it like the wide line from the kulmus. Okay, ולנקודה התחתונה יהיה לכתחילה עוקץ קטן למטה לצד ימין. That's what we said. מפני שתמונתה כמו יוד שתלוי בתג שלה בגוף האלף. אוקיי, ויהיה עוקץ שמאל של נקודה העליונה, היינו התג שעל גבי היוד, מכוון כנגד עוקץ ימין של נקודת תחתונה. Okay, I'll show you what he means here. Again, this is in הכתב אשכנזי, so these two, it doesn't come out so clearly in this picture. Let me see if I have another picture which makes it a bit clearer. These two okatzim should be sort of parallel to each other. Okay, let's see it again in the wording. He says here, יהיה עוקץ שמאל של נקודה עליונה, היינו התג שעל גבי היוד, מכוון כנגד עוקץ ימין של נקודה התחתונה, עד כאן לשון בית יוסף. Okay, in other words, it doesn't come out so well in the picture here, but this oketz yud on the top here should be sort of above this oketz yud on the bottom. So really they need to be a little bit closer than they show here in the picture. Okay. ומשמע מריאת דלי שני דין צריך עוקץ שמאל ליוד העליון שעל האלף, אך מפרי מגדיל, משמע לתתחילה צריך להיות גם עוקץ שמאל כמו לשאר יוד. Okay, what does this mean? Does the yud here need a bottom oketz as well, or here as well? This yud, okay? Does it need this bottom oketz as well? Why? Why should it need it? Because as we'll see in the yud, there is an opinion of Rabbeinu Tam that this is the kutzah shel yud. On the bottom here, part of the yud, okay? Or on this one here, it's this part of the yud. Here, this is yud is like this yud, except that the leg is on the other side, connecting it. Okay, so he says, even though the Beit Yosef it's mashma that you don't need this kutzah shel yud, he says lechatchila to do it because in the Pri Megadim they do say that to also put in this kutzah shel yud as well. Again, what you see here in number 9. Again, in K'tav Sfaradi it doesn't have it. Right, so they said here in Minhag Sfaradi the law of din and oketz the Rabbeinu Tam b'yud she'ala. Okay, so that's the lechatchila, the shape of the aleph. Now he gets into some b'diavad situations on the aleph. אם נגעו יהודי האלף העליון או התחתון, בגג האלף יותר ממקום בדיבוקו. דהיינו שאין עיקר הראש, אלא קו משוך בשווה. Okay, this is what you see here in this picture. I don't know if you could see clearly, but there has to be a thin line connecting the yud to the gag, and then it should get wider. But if it's not thin and gets wider, then he says that's pasul. Okay? In other words, even though we said Chatchila, it should be a yud, or but b'diavad it could be like a vav or something. But the connecting part has to be thinner than the wider part than it gets afterwards. Okay, that's one thing that is mativ. So he says, אם נגוי יודע א' העליון או תחתון בגר א' יותר ממקום דיבוקו. Let's see if there's a picture for it, number 11. Yeah, no. Pages. Okay. דהיינו here, like here, דהיינו שאין ניכר ראש אלא כמה משוח בשווה, וכן יודי השין, if the yudim of the shin, we'll see the shin is also comprised of yudim. They become, flat instead of thin and then getting wider. Va'ayin, va'pei, va'tzadik, or rosh hashmali sheba'ayin. All these are cases where you have yudim, va'tzadik. Okay? שצריך להיות כעין זין, מספר כתיבת המגן, so it should be like a זין, so again, it has to be thin and gets wide. אם נגעו בגוף האות יותר ממקום דיבוקם, פסול. So if it touches the גוף האות, it means the center part of the letter, more than it should be touching, then it's פסול. How can you fix it? So he says, רק אם לא כתב עדיין יותר בתפילין ומזוזות, if you haven't written further, so then you don't have a problem with כסדרן, מותר להעבות ולהרחיב הראשים כדי שיהיה ניכר הראש. Okay? So what you can do is simply make, even though it's fully touched, so there is no thin and wide, if you make the end wider, then that will essentially make the connecting part thinner, and then that would make it kashir. That's one way to correct it, and that doesn't involve any erasing. To make, if it's too wide, if the connecting is not thinner than the wider part afterwards, so you would simply make the end wide. Okay, another way to connect it is another way is to erase it and then rewrite it. Okay, this only works if you haven't written further in Tefillin Umezuzot. So the question is, how much do you need to erase? So in Sif Yudchet there, the Mishnah Berurah gets into a whole long discussion on it. Some said you need to erase the entire aleph. However, the Mishnah Berurah is more lenient. He says you don't need to erase the gag. In other words, the diagonal part. You just need to erase the yud and rewrite it and connect it. He seems to say that that Mikaradin, that's sufficient. Although he brings there more stringent opinions that you should also erase the gag. In other words, the question is, when I connected it fully to the gag, does that mean that I wrote the gag properly, just the yud incorrectly? So it's enough to erase the yud or rewrite it, or does that somehow make that I wrote the entire gag incorrectly? So he says in Kaladin it's fine. The gag was written properly, just the connecting is wrong, so it's enough to erase the yud and rewrite it properly. Also, if it's not touching, right? If let's say, where's the picture for this? Here they have a picture, although it's not so clear. But if we look just at the shape of the aleph, if this were to not be touching here at 4 or at 7, then that's pasul. But again, that's a correction that I can make even afterwards. In other words, if a tino will still read it as an aleph, and then all I need to do is just to correct it. So that's a correction I could make even afterwards, because it's not considered shalok sidran as long as it's read like an aleph. In other words, that it's just missing a bit here. But I do need to correct it, and if I haven't corrected it, it's pasul. They have some other cases. He says, let's say you did the yud in the wrong direction. It's b'diavad kasher. If you made the yud, here they say if you made the yud at the edge rather than in the middle, then that's fine, unless you did both of them at the edges. Because if you did both of them at the edges, then it doesn't look like an aleph anymore at all. So then that would be pasul. Any questions on the aleph? All right.
No, there is no.
Okay.
From my side.
All right, I'll just tell you, I recently met somebody who is an expert in checking Sifrei Torah, and he was complaining about that Rabbanim do not know the shapes of the letters of Stam. So even though it's a bit technical, it's good that we'll learn it so that we know what to look out for, and at least we have resources to go if we have questions. Okay. All right, very good. So we'll stop for this week. We'll continue next week.
Thank you so much. This is really important. Thank you.
Okay.
Positive.